All right, here's why this is so important. If somebody asks you, why do you believe in God? Why do you worship? Why do you pray? You might give some reason like, well, because this book told me to. And while that may be a reason that maybe sort of resonates with you personally, the very next question would be, well, why do you listen to this book? In fact, I mean, you might say, well, because I listened to this book because it said that, it says God wrote it, so that's why I listened to it. And then the very next question, of course, would be, well, then why don't you listen to this book? This was the Book of Mormon, another testament of Jesus Christ. Why don't you listen to this one? This one says God wrote it, so now we've got two books. Which one are we going to listen to? And then you don't have to stop there. Then you can go, to all sorts of other books. How about this book over here? Let's see, this one's Greek myths. If our reason for believing is because there's a God in it, wow, we got lots of gods in this one. Look at that, tons of gods. Why not believe this one? And the list goes on and on. Why not some Hindu text? Why not the Quran? Why not some Buddhist text? Why would you base your life on some very old book that you arbitrarily chose? Or, speaking of very old, why not something a lot more up to date? Why don't we base our life on this book? This one's called The God Delusion, written by Richard Dawkins, New York Times bestseller. This one's much more up to date, very recent, and it says the exact opposite of this book. You read this one and it says there is no God. You read this one and it says there is a God. If you're going to base your life on a book, well, this one seems to be a whole lot more current. Let's base our life on this book. Why not? That's the question. That's what we're going to be tackling today and in the weeks ahead. Why? Why do we do anything as Christians? If it all comes down to faith, then what is that faith based on? Okay, we're going to start with this very famous verse back in Hebrews 11, verse 1, where you have what seems to be sort of this definition of faith. And here's the way the Hebrew writer describes it. He says, now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. So the way the Hebrew writer describes faith is he describes it as assurance and as conviction. Now those both are kind of similar concepts there. You're assured of something, you're convicted of something, and it's the assurance of something that is hoped for, and the conviction of things that are not seen. So thinking through what each of those are, we've got, if you're hoping for something, that's thinking of something in the future. Here's the way I picture it. Picture a time like this timeline here. So let's say, here I am in the present, right here, and all of this over here is future, all of this is past. Now, great thing about the way time works is things in the past, for the most part, those you can remember what happened in the past, but the future, you get this big question mark. All of this part right here is pretty well unknown. You can kind of predict some things, but how much do you really know? Well, that's the nature of time. It's somewhat of a mystery. And so in a lot of senses, future is always in this kind of unseen kind of realm, which is why he mentions this future right here. He mentions it as far as hope, that this assurance of something that's future. Another way you can think of it with this conviction of things not seen. Here's the way I like to think of this. The way things work as far as our physical limitations. This is me. There are certain things that I can see with my physical senses. Being a human, you can touch things, see things, smell things. And so there's all this stuff right here that's within the realm of my physical senses. However, there are also things that are outside that realm. And those things I can't physically see, but we all believe in certain things that we can't physically see. For example, I believe in germs. Now, I haven't personally looked under a microscope and seen germs, but I feel like there's enough evidence for me to believe that germs do exist. So that would be kind of this thing of something that's outside of my personal physical senses, and yet I've It's something I feel like there's enough evidence to, yeah, I believe in that. So what I want to point out from both of these things, this future concept, is that we all live based on the things that we haven't seen, we believe are going to happen in the future. We also all live by things that we can't see, that are right here in the present, but we believe by through some evidence that we put together. Now that's kind of along the lines of what you have with faith, although faith seems to, the things that he is thinking of are so much more important, so much bigger than just germs. Now you could think of some examples of how this assurance works in some physical areas. So we mentioned germs. You could also think about with future areas. Basically, every choice you make in life is based on some kind of predicting of the future. If I'm going to cross the street or not. Well, I look and I see a car coming, and I judge, all right, am I going to get across the street before that car gets here? It's way back down the road, so yeah, I should easily be able to walk across the street before the car gets here. Now, that's not something I've seen yet. I've seen things happen like that in the past, so I can kind of predict the future, but I haven't actually seen the future yet. So I'm building my life on this conviction of what I believe is going to happen. Now, I think it's really helpful for thinking about the concept that the Hebrew writer has here, although when you put it into a religious setting, it goes so much further and so much deeper. The Hebrew writer has in mind things like heaven, things like things hoped for, something I haven't seen heaven, but I hope for that. And faith is the assurance of that hope. Or you think about conviction of things I haven't seen. I haven't seen God, and yet I'm convicted that there is a God. Big concept, changes my life. And it's based on this concept of faith. All right, so lots of things here that we can think about that require faith as a Christian. I mean, you see so much of the Christian life is about living in this unseen kind of realm. That rather than living my life on things that I can perceive physically, living my life based on all of these concepts that I've never seen, I just have to trust and believe. So that brings up the really big question, and here's what I really wanted to do today in this study. I want to talk about what I see as the biggest misconception about faith. That when people talk about faith, here's what I believe is one of the biggest things that people misunderstand about it. And this, a lot of times Christians misunderstand it. Certainly non-believers misunderstand it about this. And here's the concept. Faith equals belief without evidence. What do you think? Is that a definition of faith? We've listed a lot of different things together that we have to take by faith as Christians. Question is, why do we take this by faith? A lot of people have this concept that because you can't see it and yet you believe it, therefore it's belief without evidence, which is why it's faith. Now, there are a lot of things I mentioned, like germs, that I believe in germs, but most people wouldn't really call that faith because, there's plenty of evidence for why we would believe in germs. So a lot of people would say, all right, so if you got evidence, then it's science or it's fact or it's truth or something like that. But if you don't have evidence, then it's faith. And that's how religious faith differs from just, the rest of the world, scientific stuff and truth and all of that. The question is this biblical? That's what we're going to try to figure out. All right, here are some passages to think about this. The first one is just dropping down a little bit into Hebrews chapter 11, verse 11. Here's why I don't think this is biblical. All right. Hebrews 11 goes through and gives us all these examples of people who lived by faith. And here's a really interesting one. Look at Sarah. Here's the way the Hebrew writer explains Sarah's faith. By faith. So we're going to talk about Sarah's faith. By faith, Sarah herself received power to conceive, even when she was past the age, since she considered him faithful who had promised. Okay, so she has faith that she's going to be able to have a baby. She received that power to do that, even though it was physically impossible. She was past the age of being able to have children. Why did she have that faith? All right, here's what she says. Here's what the Hebrew writer says about her. She considered him faithful who had promised. Here's the point the Hebrew writer is making. Sarah's faith was based on two things here. God's faithfulness, she considered that. She thought about that. She thought, I do see that God is a faithful God. It was also based on the fact that God had promised it to her. If either one of those two had been missing, there would have been no reason for her faith. If God wasn't faithful, he could have promised something, and then is he going to do it or not? Well, we've all known a lot of people who've promised us really nice things and it never came through, and we kind of knew it wasn't going to come through because we kind of knew the person wasn't very trustworthy. On the other hand, God could be very faithful, but maybe he never promised her a baby. There's lots of women who have prayed for babies and hoped that they would have a baby and never had a baby because God had never made a promise that they would have a baby. On the other hand, Sarah could have, if she had not received this promise and had not believed that God was faithful, if she hadn't had those things, she still could have hoped for a child. And I suspect for years and years and years, she had hoped for a child. She had probably thought, well, this month I'm going to have a child. This month I'm finally going to get pregnant. No, well, it didn't happen that month. I bet it's going to happen the next month. She probably did that. And over again, she was probably let down. But what changed this time? Now she had a promise from God. Now, her considering God faithful, what's really interesting about this whole example is initially she didn't. Initially, remember when she received the promise? She laughed. She thought, no, that will never happen. I passed the age of having children. Of course that's not going to happen. But the Hebrew writer seems to be saying that at some point there's a change in her heart that she thought, okay, I get it. God told me, and I know God's faithful. Now, how did she know God was faithful? Was this just, well, I hope God's faithful? She considered it. She thought about it, and she thought, yeah, God is faithful. Now, how could she have come to that realization? I think you look at that story, she could have seen in her life areas where God was faithful. You read Genesis. You read the time when they went into Egypt and they lied and got themselves into a bunch of trouble, and then God rescued them from that. She could have seen, hey, God was faithful to me. He took care of me just like he promised to my husband that he would take care of us. So she had reason in her life previous to see that God was faithful to what he had promised. And then he makes a really huge promise, and she thinks about it, and she's like, yeah, I can see God's faithfulness. I can see God's promise. I believe it's going to happen. All right, let's put this together. Here's the way I wanted to illustrate this to show, I really want us to understand this idea of faith is based on something. Here's how I want to put this together. All right. I think of faith as being this chasm where here you are in your car. You can, at this point, you're on this nice solid road. This is living by what you can physically see. But here's Sarah back here. She's over here. She needs to get to here of having this baby. Between those two things is this impossible chasm, this thing that we physically can't cross. How does Sarah get from here over to here? Well, the way I want us to visualize it is thinking of faith as being this bridge. So you think of faith as this bridge that takes you across that chasm of what seems to be the impossibility over to what God has actually promised. That's where faith is. Now, the challenge is, with any bridge, it's got to have support. If, for example, if Sarah, earlier on, before God had promised this, had said, I just truly believe that I'm going to have this baby, what would have happened? I mean, this bridge is not going to support anything. There's no support there for it. You can say, oh, I have faith. I believe. Well, what do you believe in? So, the way I want us to visualize this is like this. Thinking about it in terms of we've got to have some kind of reasons for why we believe. And for Sarah, her reasons were that she believed God had promised it, and she believed God was faithful. You put those two things together, and then she had this bridge that supported her because it was based on something real. Now, I really want us to keep this image in our minds and think through this is how faith works. Because so often we have beliefs that we hold that we say, well, I have faith, and I know this is true because I have faith. Well, it may be that I have this kind of faith. I just feel it in my heart. Well, is that a reason to believe it? There's a lot of things a lot of people have felt in their hearts. But if it's not based on some actual reason, it's going to fall apart. It's not going to be real. And you can think about all the different kinds of concepts that people believe that, both religious people and non-religious people, that, well, I believe, like we mentioned, all those other different religious books. Well, I believe in this book. I believe in the Book of Mormon. I believe in the Quran. Why? Do I believe it because of this? Because I just really want to get from here to there? Or do I have some reason for that belief? You could even turn it around and you could think about, we mentioned this book by Richard Dawkins. I believe there's no God. Well, why do you believe there's no God? Well, I just believe there's no God. Does it look like this? Or do you have some reasons for believing that there's no God? That's the question. And so in this study, for the next several weeks, we're going to be working on finding these reasons that support our faith. Because faith without reasons, without any kind of evidence to build it on, is going to collapse. All right. Well, let's get in and talk about that. What I want to do now is go through several different passages in the New Testament and show that the New Testament Christians had a faith that was supported by something. So, here's the first example. Acts chapter 2. Going right back to the beginning of the early church. When Peter was going to preach this sermon to all the people who had crucified Jesus, and the church was getting started. Okay, so here's how Peter preaches that first gospel sermon. He says, "Men of Israel, hear these words. Jesus of Nazareth, a man attested to you by God with mighty works and wonders and signs that God did through him in your midst, as you yourselves know. This Jesus delivered up according to the definite plan and foreknowledge of God, you crucified and killed by the hands of lawless men." Okay, here's what Peter's doing at the beginning of his sermon. He's saying, you saw this. You were there. You yourselves know this. You know that there were some mighty works, wonders, signs. They were right there in your midst. And then what you did was you crucified and killed him. Peter does not start out his sermon by saying, hey guys, I want to tell you, Jesus is the Christ. How do I know that? I have faith. What I want you to do is I want you to have that faith too. So just believe it, guys. He doesn't do that. He gives them a reason. He spends a lot of time trying to give them a reason. He says, guys, the reason was right in front of you. God showed you all these miracles. this is only a few days earlier. I mean, 30 days or so earlier that Jesus died and was resurrected. And just before that, he was there in the temple doing all these miracles, and you all were there with him. You saw it. And after seeing all these miracles, you decided to turn around and kill him. Now, let's go back and think about the miracles. Don't you guys see? There's reasons to believe that he wasn't just a man. So Peter starts out his sermon by giving evidence through miracles. All right, let's look at another passage where where the early Christians built faith through evidence. Acts 17, verse 2. And Paul went in, as was his custom, and on 3 Sabbath days he reasoned with them from the Scriptures, explaining and proving that it was necessary for the Christ to suffer and to rise from the dead, and saying, this Jesus whom I proclaim to you is the Christ. Okay, here's the way Paul does this. He could have just said this. I mean, it could be that all we have is just this right here. This Jesus who I proclaim to you is the Christ. Well, why? Well, I believe it. I know it, and you should believe it too. No, that's not what he does. He goes to some Jews who already believe in the Old Testament Scriptures. And then he says, all right, let's open up the Old Testament Scriptures. Don't you see? It says here that, and then he goes through these different prophecies, and then he says, don't you see how from these prophecies it's necessary that he's going to suffer? And then look how Jesus suffered. And don't you see how these descriptions of his suffering line up just so perfectly with what Jesus did? And he said, look, he's proving it. Now, it's still faith. It's still belief in something they haven't seen. I mean, there's still so much here that's going to be outside the realm of their physical perception. And yet, it's not based, the bridge is not supported by air. The bridge is supported by, in this case, something that they already believe to be trustworthy, the Scriptures. So far we've had their faith being supported by miracles. We've had their faith being supported by Scriptures that they already trusted. Let's keep going here. Let's see. This one I don't have on this but if you can turn on your Bibles, let me just give you one more example of this. This is also in Acts 17. Acts 17, verse 30. Here at the end of that chapter, he says, the times of ignorance God overlooked, but now he commands all people everywhere to repent, because he has fixed a day on which he will judge the world in righteousness by a man whom he has appointed, and of this he has given assurance to all by raising him from the dead. He says, he's given assurance to all. How has he given assurance? By raising him from the dead. So in that one, Paul is saying, look, God gave you proof. What was the proof? The resurrection. All right, so far we've had things like the Scripture, miracles, the resurrection. These are all different kinds of concepts that the early Christians used to give evidence, foundation, reason for their belief. And the list goes on and on. There's actually a lot of scriptures you can look at with this, where the way that God convinced people of things was not just through, well, just believe it. There was some kind of reason for that belief. And what's interesting is it's different for different people. In this case, they had already gotten to the point of believing in the Scriptures. And so therefore, the Scriptures could be a very reasonable evidence. But for a lot of people, they're not to this point yet. So the Scriptures are not going to be the evidence. You're going to have to back it up a bit. For those people who'd seen the miracles were a great evidence. For a lot of people, they hadn't seen the miracles. Therefore, how much of an evidence would it have been? Well, that's something we're going to talk about. So different people are going to take different kinds of evidences and build their faith off of it. There's another example. Let me see if I have this one. Acts 14. This is a neat one, and I don't have it printed out here as well. But Acts 14, verse 15, Paul's talking to some pagan audience again, and here's what he says: "Men, why are you doing these things? We also are men of like nature with you, and we bring you good news that you should turn from these vain things to serve a living God, who made the heaven and the earth and the sea and all that is in them. In past generations, he allowed all the nations to walk in their own ways, yet he did not leave himself without witness." I really like that term. He did not leave himself without witness. It says, for he did good by giving you rains from heaven and fruitful seasons, satisfying your hearts with food and gladness. He says, God let you kind of do what you wanted to do in a way, but he didn't leave himself without witness. There was some kind of witness to say, hey, there is a God. Now here, Paul's talking to some pagans here. There was some evidence there to say that. And he says the evidence was he provided for you. He gave you rain. He satisfied your hearts with good things. So there, Paul's appealing to the fact that can't you see God's care in your life? That's an interesting one. Now, all of these in Acts are so brief, we're seeing just such a small clip of the sermon, that there's really not a lot there to base a huge argument off of. But in the studies up ahead, hopefully we can dig more into this and kind of expand on these concepts and think about, well, how do these things actually give us some support for some sort of belief? All right. So what I've seen when I've talked to different Christians, and you can think about this for you, when I've talked to different Christians about why do they believe, here are some of the things I've run across. I think different people believe based on things like the evidence of creation. That sometimes people will believe because you look around at this world and it looks like it was designed by somebody. It doesn't look like it just came about by accident. Another belief, another argument that's often used to bring people towards faith would be what I would call more of a philosophical argument. That sometimes you have this, you can read a lot of different books that will give these sort of philosophical ways. One of the big ones that I think is more famous is C.S. Lewis's books, his book Mere Christianity. He really dives into the philosophical at the beginning of that book where he talks about the problem of evil and why is it that we have a conscience and all of that. And he does this really elaborate argument to where by the end of it you're like, yeah, there's got to be a God responsible for that. That's really the only explanation that makes sense for the fact that we have a conscience like that. Another kind of argument, and this is just kind of getting us to brainstorm the different things that have brought different people to belief. Another one I would say is just personal experience. And what I mean by this, well, for a lot of people, this can be taken in some wrong directions and can end up as that bridge with nothing under it. For many people, I think it can be at least the start of a solid foundation for their faith, that someone will see God's care in their life and realize there's got to be someone out there. There's a really neat example of this. Several years ago, there's a woman who came to the church building here and told me, she said that, I'm a Buddhist, but my daughter was very, very sick and it didn't seem like there's any way for her to get better. And then she did. And I really believe now that there had to be some sort of God that took care of her. And so I've come here to pray to that God, even though I'm a Buddhist and I don't really know anything about God. That was really interesting. That was, at this point, there was very little faith. There was very little knowledge of anything. And yet there was something that she was starting to put reasons together to say, maybe there is a God. Now, again, that wasn't really enough foundation to really build a life on, but there was something there. And I think for a lot of people, those are kind of the little spark that starts us thinking in those directions. Another kind of evidence that we'll often look to is the fulfilled prophecy in the Bible. You read the Bible, and the more you read it, the more you start to see, all right, God promised it over here, he fulfilled it over here, and you see how all that fits together, and you're like, this wasn't written by just humans. There was definitely a God behind that. And so that's another one that I think is very powerful. Another one would be the unity of the Bible. That just when you see the way the whole Bible fits together, and you just, the more, maybe even more than just the unity, just the nature of the Bible, the more you read it, the more you realize it just doesn't read like it's a book from humans. Another one that I think would be the character of Jesus. That a lot of times, I think of this when, you remember that passage in John when the Pharisees send soldiers to arrest Jesus, and the Pharisees come back, and the soldiers come back having not arrested Jesus, and they say, no one ever spoke like this man. Well, what's the argument they're giving there? We were blown away. This is not just a normal human. So many different ones, and each of these are things you can dive deep into and really build a faith off of. And you can search yourself and think, like, what is it that my faith was initially built off of? What is it built off of today? The one that I'm going to be looking at in the next few studies is going to be what I call a historical reason for our faith. Looking at history, what does that teach us about whether or not we should believe in the Bible or not? So that's what we're going to be looking at in the next few studies. All right, lots of different things. But in this study, I really wanted to introduce this concept of you need some kind of reason. There's a lot of things we believe with no reasons at all, and that's a problem. Now, let me do this real quickly. Let me show you a couple more scriptures. For example, here's when Paul basically tells some people, you don't have a reason for what you believe. He's on trial. He says, now I stand here on trial because of my hope in the promise made by God to our fathers, to which our 12 tribes hope to attain as they earnestly worship night and day. As for this hope, I am accused by Jews, O king. Why is it thought incredible by any of you that God raises the dead? This is really interesting. Why is it thought incredible that God raises the dead? What is Paul doing here? He's saying, you have no reason for that belief. That's the point he's making here. He's saying there's no reason for it. He's saying, think about it. You're saying that God would never raise the dead. Why do you think that? He's asking the question that. And then he says, I myself was convinced that I ought to do many things opposed in the name of Jesus. Here now Paul says, guys, look, I was wrong and I changed. Paul is trying to help them see there's nothing underneath their bridge. And a lot of times we need to examine that for ourselves and say, do I have anything under my bridge? Am I about to walk onto a bridge that's totally unstable because it's based on wishful thinking? All right, now I want to bring up an opposing concept. Someone might say, after we've done a big study like this, saying that faith is always based on evidence, faith needs to be based on evidence. Someone might say, what about Thomas? Isn't the whole point of the Thomas story that Jesus rebuked Thomas for desiring evidence? Wouldn't that show that the best kind of faith, the faith that we should all long for and look for, is that faith where there's no reason about it, just I believe for no apparent reason whatsoever? Isn't that what the story of Thomas teaches us? And I would say no. Here's why. Jesus said to him, have you believed because you have seen me? Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed. So it seems like Jesus is saying, look, Thomas, you wanted evidence, you wanted to see and touch? Don't be like that. You need to be like these people who see nothing and they say, yeah, I still believe. Well, is he really rebuking Thomas for desiring evidence? Here's what's interesting. The very next verse in this. Here's how John continues that. Now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written so that you may believe, and that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. So John follows this up by saying, now look, Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples. So Jesus did all these signs, and I've written these down so that you can believe. I've written these so that you can believe. So John seems to be trying to tell us, look, the reason why you need to believe is just because belief is great and that you need to believe. No, that's not what he says here. The reason you need to believe is because of signs. So John himself does not seem to be advocating this believe because of no reason. He's trying to say the reason you believe is because Jesus did signs. Now, what John's trying to help them not be like is Thomas. who Thomas says, look, I'm never going to believe unless I can touch him. Saying, hey God, here's the evidence you have to give me or I will not believe. Jesus is trying to show Thomas, you've already got the evidence. You've got enough already. Now, did Thomas have enough already? Think about it. He'd seen all those miracles that Jesus did. He'd heard Jesus saying, I'm going to die, I'm going to rise from the dead. I mean, he'd heard Jesus saying that. He'd had the other apostles come to him and say, we just saw Jesus resurrected from the dead. He's had all of those things come together. And instead of saying, all right, I get it, he says, God, I will never believe unless you do X, Y, and Z for me. Jesus says, that's the wrong kind of attitude. Instead, I've given you what you need. You just need to line up all of those evidences and see where it takes you. And that's exactly what John is asking us as the reader to do. He's saying, look, I've given you all these evidences. I want you to line them up and see if it brings you to a belief. That's what we're going to be working on over these next few weeks. We're going to be trying to line up all of the evidences and see if it gives us a solid enough foundation to believe in God, believe in the Bible, and follow him. That's what we're going to be doing. And you can judge for yourself. It's going to be the kind of thing where we can put it together and you can weigh the evidence and think through, do I have a solid enough foundation to actually have a faith? And I present this first lesson now to really try to help us consider, do we have reason for what we believe? All right, let me read a couple comments and then I'll close with one last scripture. Tamika says, unfortunately, the evidence for some people will be on the day of judgment. That is really sad. That for a lot of us, we're going to reject everything and we're not going to believe it until every knee bows. Rebecca says, and didn't Thomas receive the eyewitness testimony of the other apostles before wanting to see the evidence himself? Great point. Absolutely. That seems to be what Jesus is getting at here. All right, so let's consider, why do I believe? And so the reason this study I think is so important is it's going to help us go back to the basics and think about, why do I believe what I believe? Do I have a reason for that? And finally, the reason why a study like this is also so important is because of what Peter says. But in your hearts, honor Christ the Lord as holy, always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you. But yet do it with gentleness and respect. We are commanded to be able to give other people a reason for why we believe. And I really want in this study to help us think through, why is it that I believe? Is there anything underneath that bridge? And if there is it something I can share with other people? Because Peter says, I need to be sharing it with other people. If I just come to them and say, well, I believe because I just believe. Well, nobody's going to want to walk on that bridge. Maybe I will, but nobody else is going to want to. Peter says here, no, I need to provide the reason why I believe that. That's what we're going to be working on for the next couple weeks. All right, thank you all so much for joining us in this study, and thanks for all the comments. I'm excited about it. I think it's going to really help us a lot